Hello, this is part 4 of my video series entitled Genocide in the Bible. If you haven't seen the first 3 videos, I encourage you to stop this video and look at those now. The issues that we're actually going to be dealing with in this series centers around the Canaanites in the books of Deuteronomy and Joshua, the Midianites found in Numbers 31, and the Amalekites in 1 Samuel 15. The question I asked in my last video when I left off was, do we have any precedents or paradigm cases that are similar to these cases in which there are orders or actions to annihilate? As I stated, there are very few situations in the Old Testament in which something like these judgment situations actually occur, and something like this either occurs or is ordered. 3 cases I want to look at right now is the case of Sodom and Gomorrah, the flood, and the Amalekites. And I'm going to just touch on the Amalekites found in 1 Samuel 15. I want to spend more time on that a little bit later in the video series, but I want to touch on it now because I believe it demonstrates a definite pattern with God and God's judgment found in the Old Testament. We'll also look at one anti-example that will function as the control data, and that is the story or the case of Nineveh, which is found in the book of Jonah. Now, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah seems similar to the cases that we have when it comes to the Canaanites, Midianites, and Amalekites. It seems similar with the main exceptions that the cities were destroyed without human agency, and that the vegetation was also destroyed. God used some type of natural, the Bible tells us that God used some type of natural disaster to accomplish the destruction. Now, there are several known facts about this situation that might prove relevant for our discussion. First of all, Sodom and Gomorrah lived in a good land, and that's according to Genesis chapter 13, verses 10 through 12. Abraham saved those cities once in a masterful military campaign in Genesis 14, after which Abraham witnessed to them. The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were exposed to and had access to the pure message of God through Melchizedek, the priest king of Salem, who probably also led Abraham to the true knowledge of God. And nonetheless, they were known to be extremely evil people, and were proud of it. According to Isaiah chapter 3, verse 9, that the look on their faces testifies against him. They parade their sin like Sodom. They do not hide it. The crimes of Sodom and Gomorrah, the crimes were both against God, Genesis 13:13, and against other people. In other words, these crimes were of international scope, if you will, Genesis chapter 18, verse 20. So for some 25 years after Abraham and the Melchizedek encounter, and several years after Lot had apparently been trying to moralize the people, according to Genesis 19:9, the outcry to God is so great that he sends 2 angels to destroy the city and its environment, Genesis chapter 19, verse 24. God had announced his intentions to Abraham in Genesis 18 and agreed to spare the city if a few righteous could be found, but apparently only Lot and his family, less the required 10, fit the description adequately, so the entire culture was judged and destroyed by God. The encounter involving Lot, the angels, and the men of the city is a vivid description of the evil of the city found in Genesis 19. And the New Testament refers to it as an example of judgment future, 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 6, with special emphasis on the sexual perversion, according to Jude, verse 7. The fact that all the men of the city were involved in the intended assault on Lot indicates that the outcry must have come from surrounding areas, hence the international scope of their evil. The destruction was immediate and total, including the surrounding cities and vegetation, Genesis 19:25, and is even used as an example by Jesus in Luke chapter 17, verse 29. Now I want to point out a pattern here. It is important to note that the people of Sodom and Gomorrah had plenty of access to truth, at least 25 years. Their crimes were perverse, public, and cause of international protest and outcry to God, point 2. Point 3, the annihilation was a judgment. Point 4, God was willing to spare the innocent people if any could be found. Point 5, children living in the households of their evil parents apparently died swiftly in a one-day event, instead of course, being killed as homeless orphans by a combination of starvation, wild beast exposure, disease, or instead of being captured and sold as slaves by neighboring tribes, and so on. And point 6, the one innocent man and woman that are found are delivered along with their children in their household. Now I want to shift gears and take a quick look at the flood of Noah. Now the flood of Noah is found in Genesis chapter 6, Genesis chapter 6 through chapter 8. And just as a side note, I'm a proponent of the local flood. So if I get any questions about that. I believe that the flood of Noah was a local flood of some type. But I do believe it was a large event. It affected a lot of people, apparently, because the Bible describes it as a large annihilation or judgment. It's very difficult to estimate with confidence the population that was affected at this time, especially given the violence. The violence was apparently, according to the Bible, extremely high, and of course that would lead us to believe that the homicide rates were horrendously high. So the annihilation or judgment involved people, involved animals, and vegetation. We also see the rather violent nature of the crimes in Genesis chapter 6, verse 13. So again, these crimes are not just against God, but they're against other people. Again, an international scope to the violence or to the evil that is described. Now again, the story is familiar or similar to that of Sodom and Gomorrah. Point 1, God decides to spare the innocent, and again warns Noah to build a boat for him and his household. Point 2, the evil and violence of the people were both against God and against humanity. Genesis chapter 6, verse 12, and very extensive. The word field is used in the scripture to describe the scope of the violence. Point 3, some of the evil was probably sexual violence or violation. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 2. Point 4, Noah apparently preached righteousness to these people for at least 100 years, according to 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 5. Point 5, this long period of preaching was an act of patience on God's part, according to 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 20. Point 6, in spite of the warnings, there were apparently no changed minds, and so on. So, again, let's note the pattern here. Number 1, they had plenty of access to truth, at least 100 years, and at least a year of specific flooding. A year of specific flood warnings. Point 2, their crimes were violent, pervasive to God and against people. Point 3, the annihilation was a judgment. Point 4, God was willing to spare the innocent people if they could find any. Point 5, children living in the household of their evil parents would undoubtedly die swiftly. The flood was more of a sudden event, as described in the Bible, much like a tidal wave. Look at Genesis chapter 7, verse 11. And point 6, the one innocent man and woman who could be found were delivered along with their children and household. So I definitely would like definitely see a pattern that's starting to emerge when it comes to God and judgment. Now I want to ask another question, and I asked this in the previous video. Does God, or did God, have a pleasant alternative when dealing with evil people that apparently were committing crimes of an international scope during this time period? I'm going to come back to this in the next video. Thanks.